Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are continuing to move through the Price of Freedom, Americans at War exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And today we have arrived at a real turning point, one of the most defining and devastating chapters of American history, the American Civil War. In the last few videos leading up to this moment, we've traced the foundations of American military conflict, from the French and Indian War that was a global clash of empires that ultimately reshaped territorial control in North America and laid the financial and ideological groundwork for the American Revolutionary War, and then the American Revolutionary War, where colonists took up arms not just in pursuit of freedom, but to shape a new national identity founded on democratic ideals. Then we followed the wars of expansion throughout the 19th century, conflicts and military campaigns designed by the vision of manifest destiny that the United States as an empire was entitled to expand westward and as far as we pleased into indigenous lands and even invading foreign territories, reshaping the continent and the people in profound and tragic ways. But right in the middle of this era of expansion, and right on the heels of a revolution fought in the name of freedom and the pursuit of liberty, just as the country was stretching its borders and adding new states and territories and continuing to argue over what liberty truly even meant, a crisis from within was coming to a head. This crisis was born from deep and long-standing tensions, political, economic, constitutional, and above all, moral. At the heart of the conflict was the question of slavery, whether or not it would continue to exist in the United States, and whether or not the individual states that had joined the Union voluntarily had the right to choose for themselves whether or not they would continue this practice. These questions expanded into the question of sovereignty, and whether states that had joined the Union voluntarily now had the right to govern themselves as they saw fit or secede from the Union altogether. The power balance shifted with the Missouri Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as multiple attempts were made to manage these tensions. But ultimately, these attempts only delayed rather than prevented the inevitable. By 1861, the division had grown too great. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, prompting 4 years of brutal warfare that claimed over 600,000 lives, the deadliest conflict in American history. The Civil War was not just fought on battlefields like Gettysburg and Antietam, it was also fought in Congress, in family homes, in fields, and across entire communities. It was a total war that reshaped the very nature of American citizenship, government, and society. It tested the durability of the Constitution, the power of the presidency, and the moral conscience of the nation. And yet, even amidst the horrors of war, it was also a time of transformation. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 redefined the purpose of the conflict, linking the Union military's objective to the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, passed just weeks after the war's end, formally abolished slavery in the United States as a whole. And while freedom did not bring equality overnight, far from it, it marked a legal and moral turning point in the long struggle for civil rights. In many ways, the Civil War marked both an end and a beginning. It ended the Confederacy, it ended slavery, and it ended the illusion that the nation could survive indefinitely half free and half enslaved, with each and every state in total autonomy of their own form of government. But it also began the long and difficult process of Reconstruction, of rebuilding a fractured nation and redefining what it meant to be American. We were only beginning to understand what it meant to be free, and if you watched my video from July 5th about the many amendments to the Constitution, you will remember that the fight for equality has been an ongoing struggle ever since. Northerners and Southerners, long divided over the question of slavery, became increasingly polarized in the 1850s. In 1859, more than 3.5 million slaves labored in the Southern states. In the Lower South, they were 47% of the total population. Slavery was profitable, and although some other nations had ended it, there were no signs that it was dying in the United States. Many Northerners had opposed the spread of slavery into the new U.S. territories for decades, and a small minority wanted to abolish it altogether. Abolitionist sentiment ran strong in the new Republican Party, and Southerners feared for the future of their peculiar institution if Republicans gained power. This is a broadside advertising the sale of young Negroes and an image of John Brown. This is also Private Gordon, a former slave who fought for the Union, showing the scars on his back. A small but vocal minority in the North, abolitionists were Christian reformers, women, free blacks, and fugitive slaves. Appalled that the land of the free was the world's largest slaveholding nation, they advocated federal intervention to rid the nation of a moral evil. More numerous were the Free Soilers, who were willing to leave slavery alone in the South but opposed its spread to new territories. Together, these groups formed a growing anti-slavery movement. With the outbreak of war, they demanded that it be a war for emancipation. This is Frederick Douglass in the 1850s. Although many in the North were small farmers or tradesmen, growing numbers, especially immigrants and free blacks, found work in expanding urban centers. Many labored in clattering textile mills and steam-powered factories. Most worked 12-hour days under trying conditions, earned meager wages, and survived with few comforts. Nevertheless, they prized their freedom and hoped that self-discipline and hard work would lead to a better life. When war came, many from this class fought to preserve the Union. Some were drafted, others volunteered. This is a Northern tradesman in the 1850s. Many Northerners wanted the federal government to support the growth of American industry and manufacturing and to expand railroad and canal networks. They wanted higher tariffs on imported goods to protect U.S. industry, and they wanted to expand Western settlement. Southerners opposed federal expenditures for internal improvements that bypassed their region. They opposed high tariffs that would hamper the sale of their cotton and tobacco overseas. And they did not want to see a growth of free states in the West that would dilute the power the slave states enjoyed in the U.S. Congress. This is a Northern industrialist and his family in the 1850s. Dramatic growth in wealth and population in the United States during the early 19th century magnified differences between free and slave states. Although most in the North still farmed, the region's economy increasingly depended on capital investments in textile production, transportation, and manufacturing. Laborers worked for wages. In the South, the principal investments were in the human capital of slaves and the large-scale agriculture they made possible. While most free Southerners did not own slaves, the economy and political power of their region depended on those who did. These divergent economic paths strained the political bonds that had held the two regions together into one nation thus far. On the eve of the Civil War, the South's agricultural economy was booming. Cotton accounted for 3/4 of the nation's exports. Planters depended on slave labor to maintain their profit margins. Some even argued that slavery was morally superior to the wage labor system in the North. A South Carolina planter named James Hammond wrote, "Your whole hireling class of manual laborers is essentially slaves. The difference is that our slaves are hired for life and well compensated. Yours are hired by the day, not cared for, and scantily compensated." This is Southern planter Thomas Ruffin of North Carolina in the 1850s. Of the total Southern white population of 8 million in 1860, only 384,000 owned slaves, and over 80% of those had fewer than 20 slaves. Still, the slave system dominated economic activity and shaped Southern culture. Small farmers shared many of the racial and political views of plantation owners. Southerners felt a strong allegiance to their state and region, and they shared fear that they were in danger of being dominated by Northern interests. When war came, many were willing to fight to save what they considered to be their way of life. This is Mr. and Mrs. James Beatty, a young Southern couple in the 1850s. Most slaves labored in fields of rice, sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Others were household workers or skilled artisans like blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers. Their owners provided them with minimum housing, rations, and clothing. They lived without freedom or power and were sometimes even subject to physical violence and psychological intimidation. Yet slaves retained a strong sense of identity. They performed acts of daily resistance and maintained resilient family networks and a sense of community. Before the war, many tried to escape to gain their freedom, and later many went to war to fight for it. This is a slave holding a white baby in the 1850s. Abraham Lincoln came into office with little preparation for leading his country into war. Lincoln began his presidency with a limited mandate, having won only 40% of the popular vote and none of the southern states. Reacting to his victory, 7 states seceded before he even assumed office. Lincoln was a highly skilled lawyer and politician, but he had little military experience. He assembled a strong cabinet and committed himself to preserving the Union by force if necessary. At his inauguration, he proclaimed to the South, "You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." Jefferson Davis had extensive military experience before he assumed the presidency of the newly created Confederate States of America. A graduate of West Point, Davis had fought Indians for several years along the frontier and later served with distinction in the Mexican War. He had experience in Congress as both a representative and a senator, and he had been Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. When he was inaugurated as President of the Confederacy, Davis expressed his hope that separation from the Union would come peacefully. But he warned, "If this be denied to us, it will be but remain to us with firm resolve to appeal to arms." John Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to ignite a slave rebellion. He failed, but ultimately became a martyr. On October 16, 1859, John Brown and a small group of militants seized the Federal Army and its weapons, but waited in vain for the slave uprising they hoped would follow. The next day, U.S. Army officers Robert E. Lee and J.E.B. Stuart brought in a company of Marines and stormed the fire engine house where Brown had retreated. They captured him and his band and killed 2 of his sons. Brown was hanged along with 6 other conspirators. In death, he became a martyr for abolitionists. "I am worth inconceivably more to hang," he said, "than for any other purpose." In this display is a .52 caliber Sharps carbine used by Brown and his men, a pike, one of 950 that Brown and his men planned to give to slave insurgents, and an iron slave collar that once had 3 prongs. Collars often had bells and were used to track and discipline slaves. The images are of the insurrection at Harper's Ferry, John Brown going to his death, and William Chinn, a branded slave from Indiana. In this next display are campaign ribbons from the 1860 election, the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861, Confederate Articles of War from 1861, the seal of the Confederate States of America, Bacon's military map of the United States, the broadside called "The Union is Dissolved," printed in Charleston, South Carolina, and a printing plate and proof sheet for Confederate $50 and $100 bills. The nation's bloodiest and most divisive war began at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina on April 12, 1861. After South Carolina seceded from the Union, the Confederacy demanded that the United States evacuate its fort in the Charleston harbor. Lincoln refused, provoking a Confederate attack. Surrounded and vulnerable, Union forces surrendered the fort after 2 days of bombardment. The outbreak of war forced wavering states to choose between the Confederacy and the Union. 4 more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee now seceded. As shown on their currency, leaders of the Confederacy were anxious to claim George Washington as a founding father for their new nation. Washington, they pointed out, was both a Virginian and a slave owner. Like them, he had rebelled when his rights were abridged. In this display is the Confederate States of America's first national flag, known as the Stars and Bars. Used until May of 1863, it was sometimes confused with the Union flag. Also here is a .577 caliber British pattern Enfield rifle musket from 1853, Confederate caps, a .42 caliber Lamat revolver with a second smooth-bore barrel, a Confederate officer's saber and scabbard, a Confederate belt plate, and a model 1853 Enfield bayonet and scabbard. The Confederate war strategy was to prolong the conflict long enough to convince the Union that victory would be too costly to bear. When opportunities arose, they would augment this strategy with selective offensive strikes. The Confederacy had fewer men, less capital, and less industrial capacity than the North, but its defensive strategy might prevail. And if it could convince France or England to recognize and support its government, chances of victory were even greater. These Virginia militiamen in 1859 display the confidence of Confederate recruits before they went to war. Many believed they would whip the Yankees in just a few months. Enlistments initially lasted only a year. The Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, was the first major clash of the Civil War and ended in a Confederate victory. President Abraham Lincoln wanted to move quickly against the enemy, hoping that a decisive victory would quell the rebellion. He ordered General Irvin McDowell to strike Confederate forces at Manassas Junction as a step towards taking Richmond, Virginia. Attacking early in the morning, Union forces first seemed to be winning, but the Confederates checked their advance. Confederate General Thomas Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall for his stout defensive stance. Late in the day, the Confederates counterattacked. Weary Union troops retreated, then panicked and fled helter-skelter back to Washington. The most important cavalry role was serving as the eyes of each army, providing intelligence on enemy movements. Cavalry also screened troop movements and acted as a mobile strike force. Union leaders initially regarded cavalry as somewhat superfluous, but the performance of the Southern cavalry at Bull Run convinced them to strengthen Union cavalry forces. This spur is from the Battle of Bull Run. This London cartoon satirizes the Union defeat and uncoordinated retreat, but it was no laughing matter in Washington. Many feared that the capital would soon fall and the North might lose the war. Lincoln concluded that winning would take longer than he had hoped, and he called for another 500,000 volunteers. In this display is the 34-star United States national flag, a model 1861 Springfield rifle musket, a U.S. Model 1850 Staff and Field Officer's Sword and Scabbard, a U.S. belt plate, a .44 caliber U.S. Model 1860 Colt Army revolver, a U.S. Model 1855 bayonet, a Model 1858 Union enlisted man's forage cap, and a Model 1858 Union officer's forage cap. Unlike the Confederates, the Union Army had to fight and win an offensive war. President Abraham Lincoln and his advisors developed a multi-part strategy to defeat the South. First, they would negotiate with border states like Maryland to keep them in the Union. Second, they would blockade southern ports, thus restricting trade with Europe. Third, they would capture strongholds along the Mississippi River, isolating the southwestern states from the eastern ones. Finally, they would advance into the Confederate heartland, especially towards its capital, Richmond, Virginia. Although details of this plan changed throughout the war, the basic outline remained the key to victory. This map illustrates the military strategy President Lincoln developed with General Winfield Scott and other wartime leaders. In this display is a surgical kit used by Dr. Charles C. Lee, Assistant Surgeon of the 1st Maryland Volunteer Cavalry, a canister for ether, which is a volatile liquid widely used as an anesthetic or painkiller, crutches made by a family slave and used by Colonel John Singleton Mosby, a prosthetic leg model, and safe conduct passes issued to Nurse Clara Barton in 1864. Neither the Union nor the Confederate Army was prepared to handle the staggering onslaught of battlefield wounded. Many of the war's earliest casualties were left on the field for days before they died or were removed to hospitals. But both armies soon developed litter corps and ambulance services. They established mobile operating tables and field hospitals and recruited more doctors. Surgeons amputated shattered limbs, probed wounds to extract bullets with their bare fingers, and stitched bowels back together. They neglected to wash their hands or sterilize instruments. Thousands of soldiers died from subsequent infections, but thousands survived, maimed but alive. Clara Barton, a volunteer nurse, wrote in 1862, "The ground for acres was a thinly wooded slope, and among the trees on the leaves and grass were laid the wounded who were pouring in by scores of wagon loads. We were a little band of almost empty-handed workers literally by ourselves in the wild wood of Virginia, with 3,000 suffering men crowded upon a few acres." Just outside the entrance to the Americans at War exhibit is Clara Barton's original ambulance that she used between the years 1898 and 1904. I'd like to show it here since Clara Barton first became a household name during the American Civil War. Clara Barton, known as the Civil War's Angel of the Battlefield, founded the American National Red Cross in 1881 as a sister organization of the Internal Red Cross. In addition to providing humanitarian aid in times of war, Clara envisioned a peacetime mission for the organization as well. From 1881 to 1904, Clara led the American Red Cross to aid victims of natural disasters, medical emergencies, and catastrophic accidents, including drought, floods, hurricanes, famine, fires, and epidemics. It wasn't until the Spanish-American War in 1898 that American Red Cross volunteers entered a war zone, but they have been a part of every American war effort ever since. This ambulance is one of 11 vehicles purchased in 1898 by the Central Cuban Relief Committee of New York for Clara Barton and the American National Red Cross to use. The committee sent the ambulance to the American Red Cross headquarters at Camp Thomas at Chickamauga, Georgia, before the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. There, the Red Cross helped to care for the U.S. Army soldiers called to Cuba. After the war, Barton used the ambulance at her Glen Echo, Maryland home, which served as the Red Cross headquarters, storehouse, and distribution point for relief supplies. Until May 12, 1864, This shattered stump was a large, healthy oak tree in a meadow outside Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia. That morning, 1,200 entrenched Confederates, the front line of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, awaited the assault of 5,000 Union troops from the Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac. 20 hours later, the once peaceful meadow had acquired a new name, the Bloody Angle. The same fury of rifle bullets that cut down 2,000 combatants tore away all but 22 inches of the tree's trunk. These minié balls from opposing sides met head-on during fierce fighting at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia in December 1862. Federal troops, and later Confederates, used advanced weapons, rifled muskets that fired spinning, cone-shaped mini-balls, rapid-fire breech-loading rifles, and rifled artillery. But both sides employed these weapons in traditional short-range fire between massive lines of soldiers with deadly results. In this next display is an image of the 1st Regiment of U.S. sharpshooters that included the best marksmen from each northern state. The uniform of Burden's sharpshooters, the green color helped camouflage the soldier's position, and a Sharps rifle owned and used by Hiram Burden during the war. It was later modified. Also here are a .52 caliber Tarpley breech-loading carbine used by the Confederates. Only a few hundred of these were made. A .50 caliber Spencer carbine used by Union soldiers. It held 7 cartridges and loaded through the stock. A .44 caliber Remington new model Army revolver, over 100,000 of these were purchased for Union troops, and a .44 caliber Kerr revolver that could be fired either single or double action. The Confederacy bought nearly every single one of these that England ever produced. The Henry rifle is a .44 caliber gold-mounted engraved, and it was given to Abraham Lincoln to try to win his endorsement. The Army bought about 1,730 Henry rifles between 1862 and 1865, but some Western units also purchased them at their own expense. The Henry was soon followed by the famous Winchester rifle. The 12-pound James shell was fired from smoothbore cannons that had been rifled using a process devised by Charles James. Although this alteration made the cannons more accurate, the rifling wore out quickly. James was a U.S. Senator and Major in the Rhode Island State Militia. In this display is a 12-pound James shell and cannons on Smoketown Road after the Battle of Antietam, Maryland. Minié balls, named for a French Army officer, were conical-shaped bullets with hollow bases. Exploding powder expanded the lead into the barrel's rifling, giving the balls spin and making them fly farther and straighter. In 1862, Confederate Generals Robert E. Lee and Thomas E. Stonewall Jackson repeatedly outwitted and outmaneuvered Union generals. Lincoln and his advisors planned to hold Confederate forces in Western Virginia while launching an amphibious invasion that would move up the peninsula from the Chesapeake Bay to Richmond, capturing the Confederate capital. But in the Shenandoah Valley, Stonewall Jackson deftly maneuvered his forces to defeat Union troops time and again. To the east, General Lee assumed command of the Confederate Army, stopped General George B. McClellan's Union advance just miles from Richmond, and then counterattacked and pushed him off the peninsula. In this display is a Confederate battle flag which was developed after the First Battle of Bull Run, reportedly by General Pierre Beauregard, when soldiers had trouble distinguishing the earlier Stars and Bars flag from the U.S. national flag. Also here is a Confederate dispatch bag, Confederate shoes, a Confederate infantry major's frock coat, a .58 caliber Confederate musket made from the patterns captured at Harper's Ferry and produced in greater number than any other Confederate-made long arm, and a Confederate wooden canteen. In the background are images of Confederate troops, General Robert E. Lee, General Thomas Jackson, Confederate troops in Frederick, Maryland, and men of the 4th Georgia Infantry ready to leave for Virginia in 1861. General Lee crossed the Potomac River and carried the war into Maryland in September 1862. In this display is an image of the Sunken Road, the location of many battle casualties at Antietam, a Model 1861 Colt Navy revolver used by General George B. McClellan, a map of the Battle of Antietam, a chess set used by McClellan throughout the war, a frock coat worn by McClellan at Antietam, and a Battle of Antietam lithograph. Lee had defeated the Union Army on the Virginia Peninsula in May and again at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August. Invading Union territory, he reasoned, might strengthen anti-war sentiment in the North and give the South recognition and aid from Europe. On September 17th, Lee met General McClellan in the bloodiest single day of fighting in the war and in American history. Union casualties at Antietam were 12,400 with 2,100 killed, and Southern casualties were 10,320, including 1,550 killed. While the outcome was a stalemate, Lee retreated to Virginia. General McClellan had stopped General Lee's advance at Antietam, but he was faulted for failing to pursue and destroy his army. President Lincoln soon replaced McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac with Ambrose Burnside. Here is President Lincoln meeting with McClellan at Antietam. Sergeant Charles Fuller with the 61st New York Infantry said in 1862, "The dead and wounded were a horrible sight to behold. This sunken road was a good many rods long, and for most of the way there were enough dead and badly wounded to touch one another as they lay side by side, and we found them, in some cases, they were 2 and 3 deep." Union forces struggled to win control of Vicksburg, the Confederate stronghold atop bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. During the first 2 years of the war, the Union Army and Navy secured Tennessee and won control of the upper and lower Mississippi River, but they repeatedly failed to dislodge Confederate forces from their stronghold at Vicksburg, Mississippi. For months, General Ulysses S. Grant tried different approaches to take the city. Finally, in the summer of 1863, he resorted to a siege. For 7 weeks, Union gunboats and artillery bombarded the town, while armies clashed and residents huddled in caves and dirt bunkers. On July 4th, Vicksburg surrendered. African Americans were anxious to join the war effort. The Union refused them at first, but eventually relented. At the outset of the war, the Union would not recruit African Americans, although escaped slaves, or contrabands, served in some units. But as the war progressed and casualties mounted, so did the need for more troops. In 1863, the Union began recruiting free blacks. Eventually, some 180,000 served. They received 3/4 pay initially and mostly served under white officers. Many distinguished themselves in battle, but others had to shovel horse manure or dig trenches. At Milliken's Bend near Vicksburg, 2 regiments of black soldiers, supported by gunboats, halted a Confederate advance. The Union Navy was integrated from the outset of the Civil War. By its end, around 15% of the Navy, over 18,000 soldiers, were African American. They were among the crews that manned the gunboats in the fight for Vicksburg. Blacks and whites routinely worked and lived together on ships. Here we have a map of Vicksburg and its defenses, a Men of Color recruitment poster, a Civil War-era battle rattle used aboard ships to call men to battle stations, a model of the USS Carondelet, a ship that was part of a combined Army-Navy operation against Vicksburg, and a U.S. Navy enlisted man's jumper, flat hat, and neckerchief. Emma Balfour, a Vicksburg resident, said in 1863, "We have spent the last 2 nights in a cave, but tonight I think we will stay at home. It is not safe, I know. In one of the hospitals where some of the wounded had just undergone operations, a shell exploded and 6 men had to have limbs amputated. It is horrible, and the worst of it is we cannot help it." In this case is a model 1858 Hardee hat named after William J. Hardee of the 2nd Cavalry. Designed for the cavalry, it was approved for the entire Army in 1858, Also here is a U.S. infantry private frock coat, a Model 1861 rifle, the U.S. Army Standard Rifle until 1863, a lithograph of the Siege of Vicksburg, Wexford Lodge after the Siege of Vicksburg, and a presentation box and gold medal presented to General Ulysses S. Grant for his victory at Vicksburg. After a major victory at Chancellorsville, Virginia, Robert E. Lee launched a second invasion of the North and again failed. Marching 75,000 men through Maryland into Pennsylvania, Lee was hoping to reach Harrisburg. But General George Meade, now in command of the Army of the Potomac, met him at Gettysburg with 88,000 men on July 1, 1863. Meade's forces occupied the high ground. For 3 days, the two armies battled with terrible losses. General George Pickett led the final Southern assault against the center of the Union line. When it failed, Lee recognized defeat, retreated, and abandoned his hope of taking the war into Northern territory. This famous 1863 photograph, which appeared in Alexander Gardner's photogenic sketch book of the Civil War, shows a few of the thousands who died at Gettysburg. In this display, we have a .58 caliber Confederate musket dated 1863 and made at Richmond Armory, a Confederate shell jacket, a Model 1850 officer's sword carried by Colonel Strong Vincent, who was mortally wounded at Little Round Top, Gettysburg, a Union canteen painted with a camp scene, a map of the Battle of Gettysburg, a New Testament carried by Union soldier James H. Stetson, who died at Gettysburg, and a lithograph of the Battle of Gettysburg. General George Pickett wrote to his wife after his disastrous charge at Gettysburg on July 6, 1863. Even now, I can hear them cheering as I gave the order forward. I can feel the thrill of their joyous voices as they called out all along the line, "We'll follow you, Master George." Oh, how faithfully they kept their word, following me on to their death. And I believed in the promised support, led them on. Oh God. Abraham Lincoln sat at the center of the Civil War. Its outcome turned on his decision about military issues and slavery. The 1864 presidential campaign was held in the Union despite the ongoing fighting. President Lincoln and his running mate Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist from Tennessee, are shown on the National Union Republican campaign banner. Their Democratic opponents, General George B. McClellan and George H. Pendleton from Ohio, are shown on the Grand National Democratic campaign banner. Lincoln and Johnson won 55% of the popular vote. To win the war, Lincoln had to maintain popular support in addition to winning the re-election in November. His Democratic opponent, George McClellan, was the man that Lincoln had named and then replaced as General of the Army of the Potomac. Although McClellan himself vacillated on negotiating peace, many of his supporters strongly favored it. In early 1864, Lincoln had become convinced that a war-weary electorate would vote against him. But by Election Day, military successes by Generals Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman gave voters confidence that victory was near. Although Lincoln had always opposed slavery, he had not favored abolition when first elected. But after the Battle of Antietam, he decided that freeing slaves in the rebellious South was critical and the only way he was going to win the war. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, made negotiating a settlement between the North and the South almost impossible. It solidified Lincoln's political support and ended the possibility that England would recognize the Confederacy. It encouraged Southern slaves to escape and join the Union Army, and it was a major step toward a more just nation where all would be free. In 1864, Lincoln named Ulysses S. Grant General-in-Chief of all the armies, then supported him as he led the Union to victory. At the beginning of the war, the Union Army had suffered from uneven senior leadership. Despite superior numbers, equipment, supplies, and rail transportation, Union generals continually lost important battles. Although Lincoln had little military experience himself, he exercised his authority as commander-in-chief and replaced his generals one after another. He finally found the determined military leader he needed in Grant. Here we have a broadside calling for escaped colored men to join the Union military, escaped slaves fording a river, a commemorative lithograph of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1864. Also here is Ulysses S. Grant's letter about the 1862 surrender of Fort Donelson, Tennessee, where he says, "Yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Also here is a commission of Ulysses S. Grant to Major General on July 4, 1863, and Grant receiving his commission as Lieutenant General March 1864. The 1864 elections pill book used in the field to record soldiers' votes is here, as well as election tickets for both the Republican and Democratic Party in 1864. And also here is a wood engraving by Thomas Nast titled Election Day, 8th November. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant rose to become the most important commanders of the Confederate and Union armies. Lee's military expertise was recognized before the war. He had turned down President Lincoln's offer to command the Union Army before he pledged his allegiance to the South. Hallmarks of Lee's leadership were his audacity, his skillful maneuvers, and his keen insight into his opponent's likely moves. Unlike Lee, Grant earned his reputation for military leadership during the Civil War. He became known for his persistence, ingenuity, and understanding of how to use Union superiority in manpower, weaponry, and logistics to his advantage. Here are field glasses used by Ulysses S. Grant, a Confederate spyglass, a camp chair used by Ulysses S. Grant, the rebel General Robert E. Lee as the Harper's Weekly cover image, and Lieutenant General Grant at his headquarters on the cover of Harper's Weekly. The cavalry played many roles in the Civil War, including gathering intelligence, making lightning raids, and screening troop movements. Philip Sheridan was the most successful Union cavalry leader. Taking charge of the Army of the Potomac Cavalry in 1864, he defeated Lee's cavalry in the Battle of Yellow Tavern, Virginia, where Confederate leader Jeb Stuart was killed. Sheridan's cavalry later blocked Lee's retreat from Appomattox, forcing his surrender. In contrast to Sheridan, Confederate cavalryman John Mosby won his fame leading partisan rangers and using guerrilla tactics. With a small band of men, he wreaked havoc behind Union lines. A master of the lightning raid, he was nicknamed Gray Ghost. Here we have an image of John S. Mosby, a Harper's Weekly with Major General Philip H. Sheridan on the cover, a slouch hat worn by Colonel Mosby, who reportedly left it at Rector's Crossroads, Virginia in 1864. It was returned 40 years later by a Union cavalry officer's daughter. Also here is a cavalry jacket worn by John Mosby and a cavalry saber and scabbard used by General Philip Sheridan. Also here is a service dress cap and dress coat worn by David Farragut at Mobile Bay, David Farragut from Harper's Weekly, Captain Raphael Sims aboard the CSS Alabama, and an ironstone vegetable dish bearing the Alabama motto, "God helps those who help themselves," in French. Naval operations along the coast and on the high seas were critical additions to land warfare. 60 years old when the war began, David Farragut stood out among the Union naval officers. He captured New Orleans in 1862, and a year later he helped Grant take Vicksburg. In August 1864, he captured Mobile Bay, exclaiming, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." A contrast to Farragut was the Confederacy's Raphael Sims, who excelled in commerce raiding. He captured or sank some 80 ships valued at over $6 million, most as commander of the CSS Alabama, a British-built sloop that attacked Union shipping from 1862 until 1864. Next here is a model 1850 staff and field officer's sword worn by General William T. Sherman during the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee in April 1862. Also here is Sherman's campaign hat. Union leaders believed that cutting a path of destruction through the heartland of the Confederacy would break their will to fight. In March of 1864, William T. Sherman assumed command of the Union Army in the West. In May, he began a destructive march through the southern heartland. Sherman had a different view of warfare than his contemporaries Grant and Lee. In his mind, wars were not between armies but between people. Winning did not mean destroying the enemy's army, but crushing the people's will to fight. As Sherman marched south from Tennessee, he focused on making Southerners feel the horrible cost of war. He started in Chattanooga and advanced carefully towards Atlanta, thrusting and parrying with the enemy of General Joe Johnston, but never engaging in a major battle. Jefferson Davis was dissatisfied with Johnston's performance and replaced him with General John B. Hood, who fought Sherman fiercely around Atlanta but failed to stop the advance. By July, Sherman had officially fought his way to Atlanta, and the city fell to him on September 2nd. Sherman continued his campaign with a brutal march to the sea, spreading out his army and cutting swaths of destruction. Reaching Savannah in December, he presented its capture to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The murals we see clockwise from left are the wreckage of an ammunition train burned during the evacuation of Atlanta, General William Sherman, a shell-damaged Potter House in Atlanta, a spike defense on Marietta Street in Atlanta, and 2 views of ruins on Broad Street, Charleston, as well as some Union soldiers. To disrupt rail transport and make the tracks hard to repair, Sherman's men heated rails and bent them around trees, calling them Sherman's bow ties. Remembering the march, one soldier said, "We burned their cotton gins, spilled their sorghum, burned and twisted their railroads, and generally raised hell." Fearing destruction from the Union Army as it marched through, some families chose to flee. The Army foraged for its supplies, and although the troops were told not to pillage, the orders were largely ignored. The estimated cost to the South of Sherman's destruction was around $100 million. In this telegram, dated December 22, 1864, General Sherman wrote to President Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." Lincoln, who was also celebrating victories over Confederates in Tennessee, was pleased. Sherman's campaign sowed bitterness that persisted in the South for generations. One Southerner who fought him said, "The conduct of Sherman's army is reprehensible in the extreme." This image is of homes ruined by Sherman's army. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant relentlessly attacked Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In May of 1864, Grant launched a new attack on Lee's army and battled him south towards Richmond. In the tangled woods of northeastern Virginia known as the Wilderness, Grant's army of 120,000 began a brutal fight against Lee's 63,000 troops that traversed 100 miles and lasted for 44 days. Grant attacked Lee several times but failed to break his lines. Undeterred, Grant moved on towards Richmond, only to have Lee follow and block him again. At Cold Harbor, Grant launched a furious assault against what he thought was a tired and beaten enemy and suffered a bloody repulse. Union losses during the campaign topped 60,000 and Confederate losses were nearly 30,000, but neither army was ready to abandon the fight. In June of 1864, Grant headed to Petersburg, a railhead south of Richmond that was vital to supplying the Confederate capital. Following his defeat at Cold Harbor, Grant moved south, still intent on capturing Richmond. Unlike Union generals who previously had tried and failed to take the Confederate capital in direct assaults, Grant bypassed the city to cut its vital rail links at nearby Petersburg. When Grant found Petersburg too well fortified for a direct assault, Union forces dug in, building miles of trenches and siege works for a 10-month siege. In early April 1865, Grant finally seized the railroad. Lee then abandoned both Petersburg and nearby Richmond. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, signaling the end of the Civil War. Lee had retreated from Richmond, intent on continuing the fight, but he found his battered army surrounded and outnumbered and realized that the end had come. On April 9th, he surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant offered generous terms, allowing the defeated soldiers to return home with their small arms, their horses, and even gave them rations. Lee and his officers signed this parole document that reads, "We, the undersigned prisoners of war belonging to the Army of Northern Virginia, having been this day surrendered by General Robert E. Lee, C.S. Army, commanding said army, to Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, commanding armies of the United States, do hereby give our solemn parole of honor that we will not hereafter serve in the armies of the Confederate States or in any military capacity whatever against the United States of America, or render aid to the enemies of the latter until properly exchanged in such manner as shall be mutually approved by the respective authorities. Done at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, this 9th day of April, 1865. The site of Lee's surrender to Grant was the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home, adjacent to Appomattox Courthouse. McLean had lived near Manassas in 1861, and his house had been a Confederate headquarters. He moved to remote Appomattox to escape the war, but ironically, the war ended inside his own home. This image of Wilmer McLean and his family was taken in 1865. Other Confederate armies soon also surrendered. Americans never forgot the ruthless conflict that they had waged against each other or its bitter legacy. 620,000 lives lost and 400,000 that were scarred, maimed, or disabled. These chairs and this table were used at the surrender at Appomattox. Lee sat in the caned armchair and Grant sat in the upholstered chair. Grant signed his document on this table. The table on which Lee signed is in the museum at Chicago. General Horace Porter, aide-de-camp for General Grant, wrote in 1865, General Grant stepped down from the porch and moving towards Lee, saluted him by raising his hat. He was followed in this act of courtesy by all our officers present. Lee raised his hat respectfully and rode off to break the sad news to the brave fellows for whom he had so long commanded. President Lincoln hoped that relations between the Union and the seceded states could be restored on the basis of reconciliation, not retribution. The president greeted news of Robert E. Lee's surrender by asking a band on the White House lawn to play Dixie. Lincoln hoped that the nation could be reunited without rancor, but he found himself at odds with Republicans in Congress. They wanted to punish the South for seceding and wanted Southern states to guarantee the freedom and rights of African Americans. Lincoln's assassination and the ineffectual leadership of his successor, Andrew Johnson, enabled the Congress to control Reconstruction. They divided the South into military districts, withholding statehood from some former Confederate states until 1870. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1865. When he died, so did his vision for reuniting the nation peacefully. The audience at Ford's Theater was startled to hear a gunshot from the president's box and baffled when actor John Wilkes Booth leaped onto the stage yelling about vengeance. But Mary Lincoln's screams revealed the tragedy. The president had been shot once in the head, and he died early the next morning without ever regaining consciousness. Northerners were shocked and saddened, then enraged. Even as preparations for his funeral began, a Washington insider noted that Lincoln's humane policy for reuniting the North and the South would now be tempered with a great deal of severity. The next part of this exhibit deals with the Southern blockade and the Civil War at sea. The Union Navy grew rapidly during the Civil War, expanding from some 9,000 officers and men in 1861 to over 118,000 by 1865. Most new sailors in the Union Navy had no experience at sea. Crews included farmers, tradesmen, factory workers, immigrants, non-English speaking foreigners, and African Americans, all living, working, and fighting side by side. Some joined to avoid being drafted into the Army, where the chance of being killed or wounded was much higher. Only about 4,000 Union sailors died during the war. When not called on to do battle, sailors found themselves scrubbing decks, shoveling coal for steam boilers, tending sails, and conducting drills. This is Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter aboard the USS Malvern. Blockade duty was tedious. Sailors spent long hours watching for any movement at sea, but even as they waited, they had to keep their sails trimmed and boilers stoked so they could spring into action to chase anything they saw night or day. This image is of U.S. Navy ships blockading Hampton Beach, Virginia in 1864. Blockading southern ports was among the first of the Union's wartime objectives, and the task was enormous. At the onset of the war, the U.S. Navy was deployed to blockade 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline with fewer than 50 ships. A makeshift fleet of refitted merchant ships and side-wheel steamers helped the Navy grow quickly. By the war's end, it numbered 671 vessels. While maintaining the blockade proved challenging, the Union tightened its stranglehold on Southern commerce and trade by capturing and controlling port cities. Near the end of the war, only one Southern harbor remained in Confederate hands, Charleston, South Carolina, where the war had started at Fort Sumter. Fort Fisher protected the port of Wilmington, North Carolina, which had a direct rail link to Richmond. Admiral David Porter led a combined land and sea assault that included 44 warships. The fort fell on January 15, 1865, and Wilmington fell 6 weeks later. The image here is of the bombardment of Fort Fisher by the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. This board game made light of a critical problem. As the Union built up its blockades, the Confederacy perfected means of running them. Cargoes were first shipped to transfer points, such as the Bahamas, then loaded into fast and sleek blockade runners, most built in Britain. They were camouflaged and often too fast to catch. More than half of them got through even at the end of the war. The Union and the Confederacy had competing strategies for their navies. The principal goal of the Union was blockading southern ports and choking the flow of supplies. Because the coastline was so long, developing an effective blockade took several years. A second objective was taking control of harbors and rivers, especially in Mississippi. The South's major goal was keeping supplies moving by sea using blockade runners that could speed past Union ships. A second objective was to raid commerce on the high seas, destroying or stealing Union cargoes. The battle between Ironclads CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor on March 9, 1862, was a dramatic turning point in naval warfare. The Confederacy had few ships in 1861, and its Navy Secretary, Stephen Mallory, decided to invest in the new technology of ironclads. He built the first with machinery salvaged from the USS Merrimack and called it the CSS Virginia. On its first day of duty, March 8, 1862, the Virginia destroyed several Union ships, but the triumph was short-lived. The next day, it met its match in the USS Monitor, a Union ironclad built on the innovative design of John Erickson. The battle was a draw, but it illustrated that the future belonged to iron and steel ships. Here we have a model of the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia at the scale of 1/4 inch to 1 foot. Also here is a piece of an armor plate from the CSS Virginia. The Monitor and the Virginia fought for over 4 hours, hurling hundreds of solid iron shots at each other, as well as exploding shells, grape shot, and rifle fire. Damage was confined to a few dents and cracks. Here is a photo of the USS Monitor after its battle with the CSS Virginia. Spies for the Confederacy slipped in and out of northern cities and Union strongholds. The government in Richmond loosely coordinated espionage efforts, but most spies for the Confederacy were passionate amateurs, many of them women. Most had little trouble passing through the lines. Sometimes they used their charms on government or military officials to obtain information. Other times they simply eavesdropped on conversations in hotel lobbies or bought the latest edition of the newspaper. Some were notorious, but most were never even detected. Even those revealed to be spies were simply sent on their way. Very few of them were even imprisoned. In this case is a .44 caliber Derringer, a gold watch from 1850, kid leather gloves from the mid-1800s, probably from Paris, a beaded bag from the mid-1800s, a brocade silk dress from Paris around the year 1860, and a velvet bonnet from 1852 to 1862, trimmed with ostrich feathers and artificial flowers. Daughters or wives of officers accompanied and provided support to many Union and Confederate regiments. Early in the war, newly raised volunteer regiments often appointed local women to accompany them to keep the troops supplied with necessities. These women sold tobacco, coffee, identification tags, oil lamps, hams, and whiskeys. They did laundry, sewed, and cooked. They were quasi-military, often wearing skirted uniforms and sometimes drawing a salary from the regimental paymaster. The name and role of these women, known as vivandières, originated with the French army during the Napoleonic Wars, when one woman was assigned to each regiment in order to reduce the numbers of women following the army. Here we have a camp stove, a tobacco twist for either chewing or smoking, a bag of sugar, a coffee sack, an oil lamp, soldiers' identification tags, and the uniform of a vivandière. Early in the war, soldiers often wore their names on pieces of paper pinned to their uniforms so their bodies could be identified if they were killed. Merchants in Union camps were soon selling water-resistant parchment tags and brass medallions that could be stamped with soldiers' names and units and worn around their necks. Both sides enticed recruits with appeals to their patriotism, in addition to cash bounties or bonuses. After the initial flood of patriotic volunteers, many joined for the cash bounty or monetary salary, $13 for privates in the Union Army or $11 for the Confederate Army. Here is a recruiting poster for the Union Army, a draft notice received by Alex Joyce of Yonkers, New York in 1864, and a reproduction of a Confederate recruiting poster. Troops on both sides were young and inexperienced. Most were in their teens or early 20s. Soldiers in the North were farmers, factory workers, and newly arrived Irish immigrants. In the South, they were farmers, mechanics, and students. Most were volunteers, many were draftees, unable to pay a substitute to go in their stead. Many died in the first months from illness or wounds. Those who survived learned to be soldiers in the daily drills and discomforts of camp life, the exhaustion of miles-long marches, and dry-mouthed terror of battle. Here we have a Model 1861 Springfield rifle, a Model 1858 Union cavalry greatcoat, a U.S. Army blanket, a Model 1842 Harper's Ferry rifled musket, and a Union infantry uniform and equipment. Also here is a soldier's sewing kit, hardtack called sheet iron crackers, a staple of the Union soldier's diet, a coffee can, cup, knife, and fork, a collapsible lantern, a match safe, and a frying pan. Union troops were well outfitted, even overburdened with Army-issued supplies and equipment. Union soldiers wore regulation uniforms of heavy wool that came in just 2 sizes, with leather-billed caps and stiff shoes. On a typical 20-mile march, they packed more than 60 pounds of gear. Atop knapsacks stuffed with extra clothes, a weekly change of underwear, and personal truck, they carried rolled-up wool and rubber blankets and half of a tent. They filled haversacks with salt pork, hardtack, coffee, sugar, dried peas, and perhaps a pickle. They slung canteens and cartridge boxes over their shoulders and carried muskets. Drums and shrill fifes called out orders in camp and in the heat of battle. The bright melodies of brass bands rallied spirits. Drummers and fifers conveyed critical information. In camp, they announced the routines of the day: reveille, assembly, surgeon's call, lights out. On the move and in battle, they relayed orders: slow march, quick time, halt, commence fighting, march and retreat. Many regiments boasted uniformed brass bands. They played in camp, sometimes even in the midst of battlefield cannonades. Sentimental favorites, patriotic airs, jigs, and polkas rallied troops and, according to one battlefield observer in 1865, revived the drooping spirits of many a weary soldier. In this case is a violin, a 7-key bugle, a fife, a snare drum from 1864 used by Samuel Kyle of the 22nd New Jersey Volunteers, drumsticks used by John C. Hustler, who enlisted in the Union Army at the age of 17, a Model 1861 infantry musician's frock coat, and a Model 1858 forage cap. Solomon Kahn of the 87th Indiana Volunteers carried this fiddle during the war and carved into it the names of his unit's encampments and engagements. Like most soldiers, he spent more time in camps or on the march than in battle. Here is a poster of the United States colored troops from 1863, and on the walls are the colors of the 84th Regiment of Infantry, United States colored troops who fought in Louisiana and Texas. Nearly 195,000 Union soldiers were held in Confederate prison camps. More than 210,000 Confederates were Union prisoners of war. Early in the war, captured soldiers were returned in negotiated exchanges at the end of each battle or released on parole, promising not to rejoin the fight. But by 1863, prisoner negotiations were abandoned and thousands were sent to prison camps instead. Union prisoners were crowded into converted cotton factories and tobacco warehouses, even open stockades. Confederates were packed into coastal forts, barracks, and tent camps. Prisoners on both sides suffered horribly, living in filth, malnourished, and plagued by disease. Thousands died. Those who survived wasted away to living skeletons. Here is a knife, fork, and plate issued to Colonel John S. Crocker, 93rd New York Volunteers, while a prisoner at Libby Prison in Richmond, and a bone lanyard and pick carved by James Allen Kibler, a Confederate prisoner of war at Fort Delaware in Delaware City. Also here is a Union officer's frock coat. Several thousand women worked as nurses in Union and Confederate military hospitals. Necessity forced armies on both sides to add women to their corps of male nurses. The U.S. Army specified that recruits must be plain and dress simply. Some women were commissioned, many volunteered. Others were relatives of the wounded or members of private aid societies. They worked far behind the lines, struggling to keep hundreds of patients washed and fed with lemon juice, beef tea, and milk porridge. They changed dressings and packed wounds. Often they could do little more than comfort the dying. Here is a U.S. Army field medicine case from 1863 used by William Irvin Wolfley, assistant surgeon in the 62nd Ohio Volunteers, a bottle of quinine used to treat malaria, a mended cotton dress from 1860 demonstrating how the Union blockade of southern ports curtailed fabric supplies, forcing many women to patch and repatch their clothing. Also here are envelopes for letters that nurses wrote home on behalf of the soldiers in their care. The Confederacy struggled to keep troops equipped and supplied. Confederate soldiers wore various uniforms, although gray jackets became common, often worn with felt slouch hats. Many had no knapsacks. Instead, they looped their bedrolls across their torsos. Tents were scarce. Men kept tobacco and pipes, a bit of soap, maybe foraged apples in their haversacks. Many ate their 3-day ration of fatback and cornbread rather than pack it. They filled their canteens with buttermilk cider and kept a cup to dip water from streams. They carried their muskets, but most had no cartridge boxes, so they stuffed ammunition into their pockets. An estimated 12,000 American Indians fought for the Confederacy, battling Union advances in the Indian Territory of present-day Oklahoma. Most were Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. Brigadier General Stand Watie, a Cherokee chief, was the last Confederate general to surrender on June 23, 1865. Here is a Confederate Bowie knife and scabbard. Also here is a model 1842 Harper's Ferry rifled musket, a cartridge box, a Confederate soldier's prayer book from 1865, a .38 caliber Confederate revolver from 1861, which was based on the popular Union-made Whitney revolver, but with a brass frame and an iron, not a steel, cylinder. Also a .63 caliber Confederate musket from 1864, and a Confederate uniform with equipment. The Civil War era was widely photographed, on the battlefield and in portrait studios. Commercial photography began in the 1830s. By the 1840s, daguerreotype studios started appearing in the U.S. cities and towns, bringing America's first boom in popular imagery. Because exposures took 10 to 15 minutes, daguerreotypists often used posing chairs to keep their subjects still. By the 1860s, new and faster processes were available. Especially popular were card photographs, which were small, relatively inexpensive photographs that were given to friends and family and collected in albums. Soldiers frequently had portraits made before they went to war, realizing that these pictures might be their last. This camera, built by the E&H.T. Anthony Company of New York, made small photographs. The multiple lenses created 4 images simultaneously. Photographers used the wet plate collodion process and produced glossy albumin prints which were mounted on separate cards. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, is also its most memorialized war. Shaping remembrance of the war would be the last act of the conflict. Although veterans groups formed immediately after the war, interest initially lagged. By the 1880s, however, old soldiers on both sides were looking back at their service with nostalgia and pride. Encampments, ceremonies, and veterans in parades became commonplace. Battlefields became parks. Thousands of memorials and cemeteries were dedicated. Beyond recognition and nostalgia, politicians in both the North and the South molded memories of the war in ways that would bolster their own agendas. In a 1913 Peace Jubilee, more than 50,000 veterans returned to Gettysburg in the largest reunion of Civil War veterans ever held. Camping on the battlefield, they relived memories, enacted battles, and made peace with the past. But reflecting the racism of that era, Black veterans were not invited to the celebration. Here are battlefield relics presented to Winfield Scott Hancock at Gettysburg in 1885. Hancock had been wounded in the battle. Also here is a Grand Army of the Republic ribbon from 1892 for the 26th National Encampment, and a ribbon memorializing the unveiling of a monument to the Confederate dead in Woodstock, Virginia, 1899. In 1922, General Philip Sheridan's famous horse Winchester, which had been preserved in New York since its death in 1878, was sent to the Smithsonian Institute in high style. Originally called Rienzi, the horse was renamed for the town in Virginia where Sheridan began his ride to victory in the Battle of Cedar Creek. The Civil War led to 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution promising freedom and full rights of citizenship to African Americans. But racism delayed full implementation of these amendments and ultimately brought a new struggle for civil rights. Amendment 13 to the Constitution in 1865 stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. In reality, to survive, most former slaves had to take low-paying jobs or work as tenant farmers called sharecroppers, delaying hopes of economic advancement. These Black men are members of Congress in 1872. Also here is an image of a sharecropper and his family in Savannah, Georgia in 1867. Amendment 14 in 1868 said that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. In reality, African Americans in the South were not granted equal protection or due process, and were often subjected to vigilante justice. This drawing by Thomas Nast from 1865 is called Franchise and Not This Man. Also here is an illustration from Harper's Weekly, 1867. The 15th Amendment in 1870 ensured the right of citizens of the United States to vote, which shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In reality, intimidation, poll taxes, literacy tests, and other restrictions were put in place that restricted voting by African Americans. I covered this quite extensively in a video a few weeks ago about American democracy, if you'd like to check that out. Here is an image called The First Vote from 1867 and This is a White Man's Government by Thomas Nast in 1868. The Medal of Honor is the highest award for bravery given to members of the United States military. Congress established the medal in 1861, and President Lincoln approved it for naval service in December and for the Army in July of 1862. For service in the Civil War, 1,522 medals were awarded, 1,198 for the Army, 307 for the Navy, and 17 for the Marines. Initially, criteria for the medal were lax. Not until the early 20th century did new legislation establish rules that restricted the medal to well-documented acts of extreme bravery and self-sacrifice. Private Francis Brownell was awarded the Medal of Honor for the first deed in the Civil War to be so recognized. On May 24, 1861, he killed the murderer of Colonel Ellsworth at the Marshall House, Alexandria, Virginia. Brownell requested and received a second medal that described his action. Both are shown here. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood was awarded this Medal of Honor for action at Chapin's Farm, Virginia in September 1864. He seized the colors after 2 color bearers had been shot down and bore them nobly throughout the fight. Fleetwood was one of 25 African Americans given the Medal for Civil War service. General David Butterfield was awarded this Medal of Honor for bravery at Gaines Mill, Virginia in 1862. His citation states he seized the colors of the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteers and, under a galling fire of the enemy, encouraged the depleted ranks to renewed exertion. He is also credited with creating the bugle call of taps. Dr. Mary Walker is the only woman ever to receive the Medal of Honor. It was awarded in 1865 for service throughout the war to the sick and wounded soldiers to the detriment of her own health. Her medal, along with some 900 other medals deemed inappropriate, was revoked in 1917, but it was restored by the Secretary of the Army in 1977. Okay, everyone, we have completed the entire Civil War section of The Price of Freedom, America at War exhibit. As I close this chapter, I'm reminded that no war exists in a vacuum. The Civil War was not merely a rupture, it was the result of deep, unresolved tensions that had been growing since the nation's first founding. From the earliest conflicts in colonial America to the revolutionary cry for liberty, and from the westward expansion of the 19th century to the rising debates over state sovereignty to choose for themselves how to rule, govern, and proceed. Every chapter before this one carried within it the seeds of conflict. And when those tensions finally reached their breaking point, the cost was staggering. More than 600,000 lives lost, a nation fractured in acrimony, and a legacy of pain and resilience that still echoes in American society today. In the war's aftermath, the country did not return to normal. The struggle to rebuild, to reconcile, and redefine freedom and citizenship marked the beginning of a new and challenging era. Reconstruction brought its own battles, not fought on traditional battlefields, but in courts, legislature, and communities. The promise of emancipation was real, but the journey towards equality remained unfinished. The scars of division would not easily fade. But even amid the uncertainty that followed, the nation began looking outward. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States emerged as a growing industrial power, increasingly involved in global affairs. And as the 20th century dawned, a new conflict loomed, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. In tomorrow's video, we will enter the era of World War I, a war unlike any that had ever come before it. It was a war of both trenches and technology, of diplomacy and devastation. And when America entered the war in 1917, it did so not only as a participant, but as a nation still coming to terms with its own divided past. If there's anybody out there still watching this video, I want to say thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. I have bought a pack of postcards at this museum, and this is the one that I'd like to give out for today's video. I think it's pretty fitting since it's the chairs that Grant and Lee sat in when they came to a compromise at Appomattox Courthouse. If you are the first person to comment on this video and tell me that you want this postcard, I will send it out to you with a little handwritten note of my thanks in tomorrow's mail. Bye everybody, thank you for coming along on this adventure with me.